It's really important, I think, if we're going to be a trust-based foundation, for us to be very clear and very specific about what we're working on and who we're working with. Sometimes we want to be everything to everyone as foundations, and I think that makes it challenging to be a trust-based funder. And I'm sharing this because at Headwaters, we've learned that the more refined and focused we are, the easier it is to adopt and implement some of these practices. The other thing I want to share with you is that I spent about 20 years of my life working in the land of philanthropy and held many strong sector-driven approaches to evaluation and learning. Ideas such as success is defined by the foundation, that we can change the world with a $250,000 grant over a 2-year period, that the foundation can measure its impact, even though we actually are not doing the work, and that we have tons of grantee reports that come in, which we never really read, and that we have presented, or I have presented, lots of data to boards that have been data that has been manipulated, and that we know what we're doing. We're defining success. And the reason I want to share that is that I've been on this journey of having to unlearn all of those paradigms in order to get to where I am today at Headwaters. So the first thing I did was to really create a culture of learning and embedded in everything that we do as a foundation. I've had other experiences where I've tried to drive a learning organization by doing evaluation work and then surprised to find out that we had no practices anywhere in really being a learning organization. So just a few specific examples of what this has looked like. We embed learning in everything. It is in our job descriptions, and it is an expectation that everybody does learning. I make sure that everybody on my team has learning time on their calendars. It is an important component of their work, and they have to make time to do this. We also include learning into our budgeting. Budgeting is sort of your strategy and numbers. And if you don't actually include that, then there is no way for the organization to make a commitment to learning. So that's the very first piece, right? To really create a strong learning culture requires you to embed it in everything. And I've just shared with you some examples of how we've done that. We have also really thought about how can communities help us define what success is, as opposed to myself, my board, or experts we hire to define what success looks like. So we actually went through a process with our evaluation consultants, that was FSG, in developing a theory of change. But instead of starting with it internally and then sharing it with our grantees for input, or defining all of the measures ahead of time, we went through a process where our grantees were the ones that developed the theory of change. That includes everything, all the components that you would expect to see in our theory of change, including the outcomes that our grantees hope to see as a result of being partners with Headwaters, and also the impacts that they hope to see over time. It was a very big paradigm shift to go from the board approving and defining to the grantees defining and setting out expectations. And I'm happy to share that theory of change with anybody if you're interested in seeing it. But it is a robust theory of change that I think really creates a shared roadmap between the foundation and our grantees, and allows everybody to be aligned on what it is that we're actually trying to achieve. The other thing that we needed to do at Headwaters was to work with the board to help them reimagine what evaluation is for. So it's not to pat ourselves on the back. It's not to make ourselves feel good about what we're doing. It's really an approach to thinking about what are we hearing from our communities and our grantees, and how are we using that information to make decisions about how we allocate our resources going forward. And that requires us to sit and listen, to observe, and to actually work in partners with our grantees and bring that information to bear with our board. So I'll give you a real quick example of how this worked. Over this last year, we've been hearing from our grantees through some conversations. It was very clear that they needed some longer term funding than what we were providing. It was consistent across all of our grantees in the stories that they were sharing and the work that they were preparing as they think about the legislative session next year. and what systems change they want to work on social determinants of health. We brought all of that information to our board, and our board engaged in a conversation where they decided to actually double our grant making last year based on what we were hearing from our grantees in order to ensure that we are better prepared for the next legislative session and for our grantees to have what they needed. So that's been a huge process and one that continues. So educating our board started with changing their paradigm, bringing them along. And there are still times when some of them say, where's the data sheet, Brenda? Where's the graph? Where's the bars? And I have to consistently do an education process. And I don't think that's ever going to change, especially as our board transitions. The other thing that we've had to reimagine is our staff roles. So at Headwaters, instead of focused on putting out RFPs, reviewing proposals, reviewing grantee reports, doing dockets for board presentations, our staff are more thought partners. They are sitting and listening. They are collecting information based on the conversations that they're having with our grantee organizations. They're bringing those themes that they're hearing into learning themes back to conversations to our board. It's a different approach where everyone gets to benefit. One of the first things that we needed to do, in addition to reimagining the staff role, was really creating a tool by which we could, as an organization, understand what was happening as a result of the work that we were doing around supporting grantees and communities in Montana. So we actually created a learning book that is made up of the 3 functions in a different approach to evaluation when you apply a trust-based lens. The first section of the learning book is one that I call Learning for Accountability. And what this measures is those things that we actually at the foundation have control over, connected to how are we living our values and goals. And we actually look at this data on a quarterly basis, and we talk about it at our board meetings. It allows us to also, as a staff, think about performance review for how we hold ourselves accountable for the work that we're doing. The second section of the board book is one that I call Learning for Decision Making. It is connected to the indicators that are part of our theory of change. And each indicator has a page in our learning book that includes stories, staff reflections based on what they're hearing, highlights that are important to show about how the work is progressing. It includes a numbers section that describes some of the impact that we're seeing. And all of this information is inputted by our staff into our grants management system, which we've had to reimagine into a knowledge management system as opposed to a grants management system. And that is something that we can pull data from and that we can bring specific conversations to the board. And that's what we use to allow the board to see how it is that data can be useful and how we can have strategic learning conversations based on what we're hearing. The last section is a section that we call long-term indicators. And these are things that we're hoping to see change, right? Because we're a systems change funder. So we want to see the indicators around early childhood and food security and American Indian health disparities. The needles on those indicators move in positive directions because there will be an indication of whether or not the work that we're supporting is making a difference. And those things are things that we should be tracking and looking at over time. And we're only going to be looking at these at 5 and 10 year increments because that's really the only way that we're going to be able to see something move on that level. And I think that's a big shift from where I was before, where as a foundation, we were trying to move those long-term indicators and measure them on a yearly basis or every 3-year basis. It's a shift for us at Headwaters to say, yeah, that's what we're hoping to move, but that's not what we're doing because our one grant isn't going to be responsible for those changes. But we do need to understand the ecosystem in which we're working to be able to look at that. So the practical tools are really that I could share with everybody is the theory of change that we've developed that really was defined by our grantees, the learning data book that has these different sections that actually has become something tangible for our staff and our board to work. And we're going to be releasing it publicly because we believe that the learning is important for our grantees and the communities that they serve as well. And then the last thing that I want to just highlight is that we've shifted from grantee reports to our staff interviewing our grantees. And so we sit and have coffee chats with them and learn and bring that information. And our staff actually comes back and enters it into our knowledge management system, i.e. our grants system, so that and codes it so that we can actually pull this data. And I think that's a great, it's a different way and a different role for our staff to be engaged in. But I can tell you that some of the information that we've learned has been more transparent and more honest and more reflective of what our grantees are dealing with than any other grantee report that I have read in my 20 years in philanthropy.